החלק הבא שלנו, כן, זה בסדר למחוא על זה כפיים, בשביל זה אנחנו כאן, תודה רבה. החלק הבא שלנו הוא שיחה בין אילון מנדל, מנכ"ל החברה הכלכלית של הרשת לשיקום האקלים, עם ראש צוות היחידה לפיתוח רגולטורי באמנות המסגרת של האו"ם בנושא שיקום האקלים. I'm now very happy to introduce you to Perumal Arumugam. I'm so sorry, I'm a problem with you, sorry. A chemical engineer by graduation and postgraduate in energy management and certificated energy auditor with more than 16 years of experience in conceptualization, development, and implementation of climate mitigation projects across the globe, covering varied sectors and technical areas, using international financial schemes and mechanisms. His resume includes providing senior technical guidance to United Nations frameworks, Convention on Climate Change, known as the UNFCCC, on substantive technical issues relating to quantification of mitigation benefits across various sectors, with special expertise in aviation-related mitigation methodologies. At UNFCCC, he also leads and supports intergovernmental processes of negotiations in relations to the agenda items on all international cooperative and market-related mechanisms and issues under the Kyoto Protocol, CDM review, CDM guidance, and JI guidance. And the Paris Agreement Article 6, שזה סעיף מאוד חשוב, כל מי שמתעניין, סעיף 6 לאמנת פריז, זה סעיף המרכזי לנושא של קיבוע פחמן. This has led negotiations on issues related to eligibility of new יותר מדי ראשי תיבות. Peru, I'm so happy to have you. I'm sorry. You did so many amazing things. Peru is a passionate believer in international cooperation and cooperative and market mechanisms as key in achieving the ultimate objective of the Paris Agreement and Convention. And we're very honored to have you here with us today. Thank you. Please.
Good morning, everybody. So thank you very much, Maya and Victor and everybody that organized this. Just a few words to introduce myself. My name is Ilan Mandel. My background is in high tech. I was a software engineer, worked in the Silicon Valley for a few years. Then in 2017, co-founded the Foundation for Climate Restoration in California, and was the executive director of that foundation for a couple of years. Then I came back to Israel to launch, with all of these partners, the Climate Restoration Network. Mr. Perumal, it's a pleasure to have you here. How was your day yesterday? I heard you were traveling around.
Yeah, it was, first of all, I think, thank you so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure, and just because that I'm sitting here, don't think that I'm a great expert. I'm one among them. I would always like to be with people out there to understand what you are doing. The climate change it's a broader cause, and I'm someone who is instrumental in terms of creating the framework that could help the private sector act in climate change. And yesterday I had an opportunity to meet the public sector here, and I seen the keenness and the enthusiasm they have in making these things happen. And also thanks to Victor, he took me around. I was here 11 years ago in Israel for undertaking something related to a carbon market activity, not from the UN, but outside of UN. So to come back here after a decade and first time to see Jerusalem was a great experience. So it was a fantastic.
Thank you very much for making the trip. We prepared a few questions that I'm sure everybody here would like to learn more about, but we don't have a lot of time, so there's going to be another session specifically with Mr. Perumal in the afternoon. So let's start. Why is the new mechanism for the global carbon market even needed? How will carbon trading evolve over the next few years? And what are the UNFCCC plans to implement the global carbon market, including timelines? Can you give us some background?
Yeah, first of all, like I think in terms of the need for carbon market, one has to recognize that the potential of carbon markets in terms of addressing climate change, right? The carbon markets are expected to reduce the cost of implementation of mitigation by 50% in terms of the current cost, which people are talking about $250 billion. Or it can actually increase the ambition. Like I think we have seen the devastating effects of climate change that's happening in the recent times due to the human-induced emissions that's happening. The potential it has is to double the current ambition levels. That's where we have to move forward. For that, the role of the mechanism and the role of the carbon markets is very crucial in terms of making these things happen. Why a new mechanism is needed? Because the context in which that we all have been working on in the international climate space has changed in 2015. Before the Paris Agreement, there was a clear divide between sets of countries who are traditionally buyers of carbon credits, and there are countries which are traditionally suppliers of carbon credits. Now that has changed. Israel can be a buyer and Israel can also be a seller. So that's the new situation that has emerged since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. So the rules needs to change that you are no longer only a supplier or a buyer. You need to be making both the roles. As a country, as a private investor, you may be at times selling your credits externally, or you may be procuring credits externally to meet some targets of your companies that in Israel might take as an obligation that they may take. Then how it would evolve over the years, I think in terms of evolvement, the markets are going to bring a lot of new players into the system. I see many of you here are going to be some of the players, I'm sure for that, because it's not necessarily that when the traditionally carbon markets are presumed, like for example in Israel, there are 46 registered activities under the previous Kyoto Protocol mechanism. As it's not that something which is completely new to Israel in terms of carbon markets. There are 46 activities that have registered from Israel. And then so earlier it is all about implementation of activity. But I think in terms of what is going to change in the new mechanism is that the value chain of the overall production and the delivery of the carbon credits that will go across the borders, there will be a larger role for different stakeholders within the system. You could be not necessarily need to own an industry, or you have to be doing something at your own facility, but you may be enabling different actors to act. So within the Paris Agreement rules that was adopted in Paris and its operational principles adopted in Glasgow the last year, there are two mechanisms for markets. One is a bilateral cooperation that can happen between countries, where the private sector will play a role in terms of helping the countries when they engage with another country in a bilateral cooperation, or the UNFCCC is setting up a global carbon market, which is the international mechanism, which is kind of a replacement to the clean development mechanism that was operating, which I said that there are some industries from Israel which has got benefited out of it. So the UNFCCC is currently preparing regulations around the operationalization of the global carbon markets, putting up infrastructure like registry system to track when the credits are being traded. And we also heard that the larger potential and the need, the sectoral, the focus that we have in this room in relation to carbon removals, etc. So we are also preparing standards in order to quantify emissions, and I see the industries and the innovators and the people here in this room are already working on helping us as a UN in reducing the cost of monitoring and evaluating these emissions, because one should recognize that every unit that is being traded as part of carbon credit to another country or another facility, you are basically allowing them to continue to emit. So we have to be responsible. When we allow someone else to emit, we have to be responsible. I think that was Victor's, the last part of the slide for investors, but it also applies beyond investors, that we have to be a responsible citizen, first of all. So we need to make sure that the credits that are being sold is not increasing emissions elsewhere. So in order to do that, the most critical element is the monitoring, reporting, and verification. So under the international carbon markets, the UNFCCC is working on them. And then within the bilateral cooperation, the UNFCCC, under its negotiations, are coming forward with infrastructures, reporting, and review when this cooperation happens between the countries.
Can you give us an estimate of the timeline? How long it would take before this whole thing becomes operational?
Yeah, for the global carbon market to get operationalized, that is being functioned under the UN Climate Change Secretariat, would take somewhere around the third quarter of next year. But for a bilateral cooperation, nobody can stop today Israel having a cooperation with India. It can happen even today. But in order to meet the international obligation, the rules are expected to be finalized in Sharm el-Sheikh this year. We have a COP, the Conference of the Parties, where all the 197 countries meet and agree on the rules for cooperation. So it's more about transparency and consistency of that cooperation. It's not about the quality of the cooperation.
Can you say a few words about the private sector? How would private sector players benefit or be able to participate, and are there any barriers of entry?
Yeah, when it comes to private sectors, as I was saying, that it's very clear that any government or any institution that want to achieve or address the climate change cannot act on its own, right? In no matter which country you are in, your private sector is a key instrument in terms of making things happen for the government or for the public sector to meet their targets. So every country in the world, that also has changed. It links back to your old question, the first question, what has changed, right? So today, every country has undertaken a certain pledge to, or whatever it is possible by themselves. It's not an imposition, but countries have determined something called as, that's why it is called as a nationally determined. So, for example, Israel has put towards a target of 27% reduction by 2030, right? So that's a nationally determined contribution from Israel. Similar way, all the 196 remaining countries have also put forward what they would be achieving. And these cannot be achieved without the active engagement of the private sector, right? And the private sector, depending on the scale of the organization we are talking about, they have multiple roles to play within the carbon markets. So one of the biggest challenges that we had earlier in terms of the private sector participation was, again, the economies of scale that is required to meet the carbon market requirements. So if you are thinking about a private sector which is something very small, you need to have an economies of scale. So there could be somebody who is coordinating and managing these things together to bring it up to the scale, because
some organization in Israel could work with a few smaller players and kind of represent them in the market?
Yeah, primarily, like when we say carbon markets, it has an allied transaction cost. It's not that you go with markets without putting any effort with respect to transaction. So in the previous era, the transaction cost is ranging between 20 to 25%. So for every $1 that you can earn from carbon credit, you are putting almost 25% of it in just transacting that carbon. So based on my minimum interaction that I heard since yesterday, I believe that one area where the Israeli private sector might be largely helpful in carbon markets is about reducing the cost of this transaction. That can make a big change in terms of not necessarily only within Israel, but even on the global carbon market scale. because as I said, that the one big fundamental requirement that needs to be met is that we are not allowing to increase emissions somewhere because of selling the credit. And in order for that to happen, the biggest thing that we need to make sure is the monitoring, reporting, and verification.
That leads me to the next question. Obviously, not just for being able to transact, but also to avoid greenwash and abuse. So if you can say a little bit about the process of monitoring, verification, certification, so on. And also remember that Israel as a startup nation, as a high-tech nation, has a lot of abilities in developing those monitoring technologies and measuring tools and systems and so on. So if you can say a few hints about, how that would work.
Yeah. So in terms of the monitoring, reporting, and verification, in the previous system, what is needed is that you need to measure to your 4th decimal point. In order for you to engage in markets, that you need to actually monitor every single part of the emissions that needs to happen. But in the new scheme of things, that the monitoring can be done through different technological solutions, like people are thinking about distributed ledger technologies, using satellites to monitor these things, and to make sure that the emission reductions that are being traded are real, verifiable, and credible. So you asked the question of greenwashing. So one of the ways that you can avoid greenwashing is to make sure that your emission reductions that is achieved are additional to what would have happened in a business as usual scenario. So it's kind of a term which looks very vague, but what you need to make sure is that every effort that is being done, you need to ensure that in order to avoid that is not a greenwashing, you need to make sure that they are additional to what you would have otherwise done without the carbon markets.
In other words, establish some sort of a verifiable, certified baseline, and then start from that doing all the measuring and the monitoring.
Yeah, so you need to have credible baseline, first of all, and this baseline is also very much to be aligned with the Paris objectives. So that is something currently that lacks in the market. Like today we have multiple operations happening in the market, be it in different ways. But one of the things is that what we from the United Nations, that we are looking at how the market is operating, we see quite a lot of misalignment with the Paris objective, particularly on the baseline. That is where you start to hear a lot of criticism and a lot of concerns about greenwashing. And this can be overcome if you can have a credible baseline that can be determined. And in order to have that credible baseline, also you need to have a strong monitoring system to be in place. And based on the conversation, and I think that is where that Israel can be, and the Israeli innovation, or your technology giants, can help different countries in reducing these transaction costs, making sure that we erase the presumption that carbon markets are about greenwashing. It's not that everything is a greenwashing.
Very good, very good. I wanna get a little clarification about this baseline, right? So let's say I'm a corporation or industrial, commercial plant and so on, and I want to establish a baseline so I can start doing things, generate credits and trade. So can I establish my own baseline, or do I need to get a third party to do that? Or do I need to go get a third party specifically that is certified by you guys? What is the way for me to establish that baseline?
Yeah, you basically have to go to, there are, so if you have a participant and you decided you wanted to sell the credits in which markets, like if it is a voluntary market, then you need to find one of the independent standard setters that exist. For example, in the voluntary, it could be Gold Standard, it could be Vera, it could be others. When it comes to compliance market, you have only one place to go, which is the UNFCCC. And this baseline standards, you can have an idea, and then we would help in making them fit to the principles of the Paris Agreement. So you can bring in an idea. There are two ways of doing it. So for example, like I'm hearing from the room in the morning that the potential for carbon removals, right? So we as a secretariat can develop top-down standards looking at different removal technologies, and we can produce standards which can be, it's for the public good. There's no charge. Like as we sit here today, the UN Climate Change Secretariat has produced more than 240 standards covering 16 sectors, sectoral scopes, and 57 technical areas within those sectors to cover a breadth of mitigation opportunities and potential to calculate emissions, right? So you can use them, but they are not fully aligned with Paris. So that's why I said today, any standard that exists in the market to quantify emission reductions are not fully aligned with the Paris Agreement objectives.
So you mentioned the voluntary markets and the markets that exist today. How will those evolve when we have the new platform, the new mechanism? Will they be merged into it? Will they work side by side?
Okay, so in this, like I would divide between the compliance market and the voluntary market. So I would start with the compliance market. So under the compliance market today, we have more than 8,700 activities that were part of the compliance carbon markets. So what has been decided by countries in Glasgow is that there is not a direct plug out and plug in. You need to make sure that the existing compliance markets have to meet the requirements that has been adopted in the Glasgow under the Paris Agreement. So you need to do some kind of a validation or a cross-check to see that how it fits. If it is not fitting, you need to make the modification, and then you can move those activities inside the new mechanism. But it has to follow the full process. So that is for the compliance markets. So when we say in terms of compliant market, there are two asset classes. One is the activities, the compliance activities, and the other one asserts is the credits or the units that are generated within those compliance schemes. So what has been decided by countries in Glasgow last year is that you can take the credits from the previous system and you can use it for the new system, provided that if they follow the certain criteria, like has to be, those activities has to be registered after 2013. If an activity is registered into the compliance market after 1st January 2013, then they can, those units can be used in the future under the NDC compliance. For the voluntary markets, they do not interact directly within the achievement or the compliance. So if the voluntary markets have to move, it's very clear from the decisions that if a voluntary credit has to be used for any explicit or implicit regulation or compliance by a company, be it Google, be it Amazon, whatever example we are talking about, they have to meet the Paris objectives. And if they are not, they cannot transition.
Very interesting, very interesting. I want to talk specifically about Israel, right? Because we're here and everybody's eager to understand what does it mean for us, right? First of all, what's in it for us as a country, as a representative of the private sector, and what do we need to do in order to play in that game, to be a part of it, and when should we start?
Okay. When do we start? I think we should start now, or we should have started yesterday. So that's where I said that there's nothing that stops from acting. Like you can wait for the rules to come in, but that should not be a barrier for us to act upon today, because everything is kind of learning by doing in the carbon market. That's one of the reasons why I said that I should also be part of one among you there. But in the last 2 decades that I have been working with carbon markets in different roles, like today I represent UN Climate Change Secretariat, but I was a project participant. Like I had my own facilities. I had 3 solar plants in India, which I have registered under the compliance market. I've been a trader, and I was with the trading firm which has had the highest number of physical traded volume under the previous compliance market, 23% of the market share. So I have played as a role as a market broker to take credits from one place to the other. So I have played different roles in carbon markets, and the way that I see and looking at Israel, I believe that there is one sector which was completely untapped in the previous compliance market or in the voluntary market, which is the agricultural sector. And it is known to the universe that Israel is a front runner or an example setter, for example, in the agricultural sector. And I believe that agricultural sector is going to have a big future. The reason being that in any country, even though they have made the nationally determined contribution, in many of the countries, particularly in developing countries, the agriculture or the agrarian economy is part of their significant GDP. So they would not be exposing to any kind of an economic strain of carbon pricing over the agricultural sector. That will be a protected sector by, if, to put it in a simpler way, if a government that is ruling today has to exist on the next day, they have to protect their agriculturalist. That's damn sure for a country which is based on an agrarian economy, right? So that makes absolutely clear that the agricultural sector is something where a lot of innovation, a lot of technological interventions, a lot of mitigation potential still is there, and which is completely untapped. And if you see me as a buyer, I always wanted something which can help a country in improving its people's social life and cause, and in the end of the day, it is about the people whom we are dealing with. And agricultural sector is a classic example. So from Israel's perspective, I believe that the agricultural sector is going to have a big future in the coming years. Yeah. And the second area is also very important to know. We as a climate change convention, as a custodian of the Paris Agreement, the first thing we wanted to do, even though we promote markets, the first fundamental thing is deep reduction at your own site, right? Like you cannot always, the problem of greenwashing comes, a company can claim that they are net zero, but if everything is based on offsets, without them reducing their own emissions, one can label it as greenwashing, because you are portraying that you are an environmentally conscious company, but you have not cleaned your own mess. You are trying to take something from elsewhere and trying to meet your own things. So to move forward, I believe that one particular component of the mitigation strategy that remains until the mid-century is going to be the removals. And I see a lot of interest and a lot of movement that is happening around removals. That's primarily because if you see, I think Victor has put something on the IPCC scenario. So you take IPCC scenario, you take International Energy Agency scenario, you take OECD scenario. If you have to align with the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree goal, no matter which scenario, removal has to be a part of the solution. And I see that again, the second potential, largest potential beyond agricultural sector is the innovation, the technology push-up that you can bring from Israel towards the sector, particularly on removal aspects, is going to be significant. The reason being that when you move towards 2030, 35, I'm not a great visionary person. I'm an implementer, and I like to be on the surface, not to imagine too much. But if I look at how the carbon markets have evolved from 2001 until now, it's very clear that when all countries have done a remarkable job in terms of putting forward their own targets. For example, Israel has put forward, India has put forward, we have put net zero, you have put net zero. So everybody has put net zero. So but that means that by 2030, we are going to have all the developing countries, at least from a carbon market world, is going to behave like a fully developed country. So which means that we are going to talk about dealing with the residual emissions that needs to be tackled. And the residual emission cannot come from technology-based solution, it will come from a removal-based solutions. And that is where I see that the long-term future that lies within the carbon markets for removal credits, not necessarily only until now, but also until the mid-century. In any scenario that we do with a global negative net zero, like I think I've seen Microsoft putting something about negative emissions. So if you want to move towards net zero, that's going to be the case. Like the political masters have moved from 5-year nationally determined contributions to yearly updation of contributions. In Glasgow, they have asked every country to update, if possible, on a yearly basis their targets, right? So the next thing that people are going to say is not net zero. They are going to say, we have to go for negative emissions. Where do you get that negative emissions from? The negative emissions can come from the removal technologies again. So that's the scope. And that also brings back to my, the previous one, we talked about MRV. The reason why the removal technologies, like of course we did not get into the geological sequestration to a larger extent, though we had a framework, but it was like the famous saying that we have in terms of the operation is successful, the patient is dead, right? So the time that when we had adopted the framework for carbon capture and storage, it's not that we are talking out of an imaginary world. The UN has a framework to deal with carbon capture and storage.
We're almost out of time, so I just want to make sure that everybody knows we're going to have a Q&A session with Mr. Perumal in the afternoon. It'll be announced. I also want to say that there's a book about climate restoration talking about exactly that, how we remove the historic emissions, and I want to make sure that you get one copy and everybody can pick it up when they get outside. I want to say one more thing about the agriculture, because Israel was an ag-tech nation before it was a cyber nation and so on and so forth. And you know, it was a desert here 100 years ago. And what we're promoting here, and we're going to hear from one of the companies that are going to be presenting here, is our desire to expand agriculture into the ocean, create aquaculture and marine permaculture and so on for obvious benefits. We're going to hear about that later. So I want to finish with just one quick question. If there's a, let's say, a public-private partnership, right, between the Israeli government and a private sector company that is doing a project in Africa, right? Who gets the credits? How is that determined?
So there are two ways of doing them. Like in the future, I believe that there will be a sharing arrangement between the different actors that are involved, wherein like if you're doing a project in Africa and you are putting a capital and from Israel, for example, in terms of technology, in terms of deploying those technology, implementing, running them, you will have some kind of a sharing arrangement where you may have certain proportion of those achieved emission reductions in Africa can be potentially used inside Israel, and the certain proportion will remain within Africa. So that's something as a bilateral agreement that would happen, because it is not going to be a binary of if you have achieved 100 tons of reduction, going forward, it will not remain within Africa. I'm sure that you as a country that is investing on them, beyond what you have provided as technological support, you may have had economical benefits for deploying those technology, but you also may wanted to gain some benefits of the carbon that is being reduced. And I'm seeing that trend because I've seen a few examples right now. Exactly like there's a country that is bringing in technology, a country that is putting in finance, and the activity is implemented in Africa. It's a Switzerland, Ghana cooperation. That's the one which is in an advanced stage in clean drinking water solutions in Ghana. And I really see, I've happened to see their contract just to make sure that they wanted us to check, not from the UNFCCC perspective, but based on our experience to see that whether it touches the chords of what is needed under the UNFCCC requirements. And I see that there is a sharing arrangement that people are talking about within those emissions. So it's not going to be that full emission reductions belongs to one country. Moving forward, I think it's going to be much more complex in terms of sharing the benefits, but sharing the benefits is going to remain there within the carbon markets. Very
good. Thank you very much, Mr. Perumal, for coming here and for all this information. And there's going to be another Q&A session in the afternoon.
Thank you very, very much. It was very interesting. תודה רבה, אילן, ותודה, פרו, על השיחה מאירת העיניים.